Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Eric Radeski. I'm the Director of Government Affairs here at Hostos Community College, and I am joined by our Provost. Provost, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon. My name is Shiang-Kwei. I'm the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost at Hostos. Welcome.
And we are here today for a very special Veladas Hostosianas, celebrating the Asian American Pacific Islander community. I want to let everyone know as we get started that this event is being recorded. Provost, would you like to introduce our president?
Yes. So President, I'm honored to join the president and panelists to moderate today's session. So this is an event sponsored by the Office of President. And so I want to introduce you to our president, Dr. Daisy Coco de Phillips.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Shiang-Kwei, my dear Provost. I want to say Veladas Hostosianas. Veladas in Spanish are gatherings where people discuss politics, culture, and everything else. So Veladas Hostosianas sort of have this twist. And so we have multiple events through Veladas Hostosianas every year. And we're very, very, very happy to have with us this wonderful group today. So May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, as we all know, and Hostos is very proud to celebrate the contributions of the Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in New York City, across the country and around the world. And it is a vital legacy covering every conceivable discipline and field of study. And it is a pleasure to recognize this ongoing history of achievement. I am delighted to have with us our esteemed distinguished panelists, our president of Queens College, President Frank Wu, and a dear friend and collaborator, and Dr. Sonilla Munshi, the interim executive director of Asian American Asian Research Institute, also a professor at BMCC, and and I want to say publicly that my son sends her he charged me with giving her a very warm hello because he has tremendous esteem and respect for her work, both as a scholar, but also as a person. So I'm delighted to meet you, and I hope, Dr. Munshi, that we get to see you at Hostos regularly. Certainly next year for Women's Month. How about that? All right. We will do that, and we wait for the arrival of State Senator John Liu. He was with us last year, and his staff has confirmed that he'll be joining us as a point shortly. I'm also grateful to have these wonderful moderators, Dr. Radeski and Provost Wang, with us today. So today's Veladas focuses on a sad and distressing fact: the increase in recent years of violence and hate speech directed at Asian Americans and Pacific Island. This contemptible behavior, and I want to repeat, more than contemptible, just awful, has occurred far too often in the nation's history. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and so much more. War springs immediately to mind. Are the hatred and bigotry we are witnessing part and parcel of existing prejudices, or have we entered a new and even uglier era of brutality and intolerance? And how do we deal with this issue? I'm going to read a little haiku because I love haikus, and because I think also it's so wonderful. The college knows that I end many of my remarks to them, quoting Pablo Neruda's part of his Nobel laureate speech, the moment where he reflects on that all roads lead to the realization that we are all humans and we are part of humanity and we all share. And so that you see the difference, and his is much more, in Spanish is much longer, the way he expresses that. I want you to hear this from this one of my favorite haikus by Kobayashi Isa, A World of Dew. Okay, a world of dew, and within every dewdrop, a world of struggle. That's what unites us. We all have ideals, we all have our challenges, and we should realize in one another that common humanity and respond to that common humanity with kindness, support, tolerance, and speaking out, not standing by silence. Because the other, you, the Asian Americans, are we, the Latino, and the Blacks, and the whites, and everybody, because we're all human beings, and we all want the same thing for our people, except for those who have become inhuman at this point. So I look forward to hearing our distinguished panelists share their thoughts, and I'm now going to turn it over to our wonderful co-moderators. Thank you all for joining us. We're 27 at this time, and it's towards the end of the semester, so it's a little tougher, but I'm very pleased that we are joined by 27. So thank you. Provost, Eric.
Thank you, Madam President. And just another reminder, this event is being recorded and closed captioning is available if you need it. So let me introduce our distinguished panelists. From Queens College, our sister CUNY, we have President Frank Wu. He is a law professor and a former Obama administration appointee to the Department of Education National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity. And he became the president of Queens College during the height of the pandemic and led the college through it. Dr. Sonia Munshi, associate professor of ethnic and race studies at CUNY and interim executive director of the Asian American Asian Research Institute. Her work is focused on race and ethnicity, as well as psychology, public health, gendered violence in the immigrant communities. And not with us yet, but who will be joining us at approximately 1:30, New York State Senator John Liu, the first Asian American to win legislative office in New York back in 2001 when he was elected to the New York City Council. He was also New York City Comptroller prior to becoming a New York State Senator. And in the State Senate, he chairs the Committee on New York City Education. And I would also say that all three of our panelists for this event were recognized last week by the publication City and State as being on the Asian American Top 100 for New York City and New York State. So quite a distinction. Let me open up to the panelists to just bring any opening remarks that they would like. President Wu, why don't you go first?
Great. I'm so happy to be here with you. I have all throughout my career tried to advocate for a vision of race, civil rights, and the changing face of our nation that includes everyone. I started because I wanted to write a term paper in college about Asian Americans and civil rights, and I went to the library and I looked in the card catalog. Some of you don't know what that is. That's pre-Google, where you had to look up what the books were by author, title, or subject. And every book was indexed on a little 3x5 card. And so I looked up the subject, Asian Americans and Civil Rights, and there was no book. And it wasn't because I was in a bad library. That book had just never been written. No one had ever put Asian Americans and civil rights together in the same sentence in a book. And for that matter, all the books on race, every one of them that I looked at, divided the world into black and white, and never the twain shall meet. And I thought, well, there's something wrong with these books. Not as an Asian American. I just thought, as someone who wanted to write a good term paper again, these books are all inaccurate. They leave out everyone who's Latino, for example. So it's not just Asian Americans, but they leave out everyone who's Asian American. They leave out Native Americans. They leave out everyone of mixed ancestry. And so I wanted to change the way we talked about this. But I always emphasize that's to help, not harm, the historic struggle for Black equality. And we can talk a little bit more about that, the importance of bridge building and coalitions. The idea is to introduce Asian Americans in an ideal and principled manner, not to push out anyone else. So that's what I hope we do. And with all the violence during the pandemic, people have become very much aware of who Asian Americans are. So thank you, Daisy, I should say, President Coco D. Philippus, for hosting this wonderful event.
Thank you. Dr. Munshi?
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you so much to all of you for hosting this event. I'm really honored to be part of this conversation. As your introduction to me mentioned, I'm currently the interim executive director of RE, but also a community college professor at CUNY and have a lot of love and respect and camaraderie with the other community college communities. So I'm really particularly excited to be here with you all at Hostos. And I think, following Frank's comments, I think there's some connection also in sort of like my location or my kind of pathway into working on issues relevant to Asian American communities. For me, my pathway into work as a scholar and teacher of Asian American studies and also gender and women's studies was actually through involvement in social movements and community work after I was exposed to women of color feminisms in the 1990s. And so I'm a New Yorker. I grew up in Queens, but I went away to college in Minnesota. And when I was there in the 90s, the communities that I felt actually most connected to, not my campus community at this predominantly white institution's liberal arts sort of campus, but really were the immigrant communities throughout St. Paul and Minneapolis, where my school was located. And I got very involved in working in spaces that were centering Black, Indigenous, and Latinx women of color, women and other communities, because those were the communities that were there. And so actually, it was when I was working in a Latino organization around issues of gender-based violence that my sort of understanding of myself and my identities really sort of started to develop. I had always seen myself as a New Yorker first. I hadn't really engaged very much with my Asian American or South Asian identity. But it was when I moved back to New York City that I decided I wanted to get involved and work in my own community, sort of learning from what I had or using what I had learned in those other spaces. And so for many years, I was involved in different types of community organizing around domestic violence, immigrant rights, queer and trans organizing with South Asian and other API organizations. But all of these groups were very much in relationship to Black and Latinx groups in New York City. And that was very much a part of our practice, really thinking about ourselves as Asian Americans in relationship to other communities of color and to really think across these sort of like racial and ethnic lines towards like shared practice, solidarities, and kind of, deep relationships to improve the well-being of all of our communities. I'll just stop there for now, but thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So without any further ado, why don't we jump into the questions? And Provost Wang, I believe you have the honor of first question.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you, President Wu and Dr. Mushi. I'll begin with my first question. So how has the AAPI community's cultural heritage shaped your personal and professional experiences? Maybe I have President Wu to start first. Yeah, thank you.
I thought I'd go second because I was going to offer a provocative counterpoint. So I'm going to tell you about a little essay that I just wrote, okay? The title is Everything My Asian Immigrant Parents Taught Me Turns Out to Be Wrong. Now, before you condemn me for saying that, the title is facetious. It's what kids call clickbait these days. It's meant to get you to read the piece. And because I would be a wicked child and contemptible human being if I failed to appreciate the sacrifices my parents made for the benefit of their children and to acknowledge the standards they set. So I want to be clear, I owe everything to my parents. That said, I want to explain the title by telling you three things. And this is related to our students. Here's the first. There are different strategies for adaptation. And my parents believed in that proverbial American dream. That's why they came here. It beckoned to them from Taiwan, where the provost is from as well. And when they got here, they had to adapt and adjust. And they did it in a way that I could never match. And I admire what they did. Most Asian cultures, and I'm going to generalize here too, have a proverb though. So here's the first quick way to explain this. There's a Japanese saying, that's the most familiar one. It's the nail that sticks up is pounded down. The nail that sticks up is pounded down. What is that about? It's about conforming, deferring to one's elders, fidelity to tradition, not making a fuss, disappearing into the crowd. There's a saying in Chinese, the loudest duck is shot first by the hunter, right? This is all about know your place and be quiet. Compare the American adage of dissent, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So in the culture that I was raised in, there's no such thing as I gotta be me. You do you. Let your freak flag fly. To thine own self be true, right? So I was a very disobedient child. And the second point I'm going to make is I actually think that blending is something that every child of newcomers has to do, but it involves reconciliation with one's own parents and grandparents. And some of the things that my parents thought were erroneous. Here's an example. In high school, in the 1980s, early 80s, in the Midwest, I managed to get elected to a student government role. My parents said, you must resign. You cannot do that. You have to study to get into a good college. Little did they know serving in student government would have helped me get into a good college and would have helped develop the skills that I need, certainly in the job that I have now. And so when I faced the common cruelty of childhood, the teasing and taunting of racialized bullying, and I would come home to my parents and tell them about this, they would say to me, just work harder. And don't protest, don't make a fuss. And I think that's an error. When you are abused and you work harder, all you're showing is that you're willing to take the abuse. We need to stand up and speak out. So that's the second example. The third, and finally, I see this with our students. So many of our students, in a way that I'm so sympathetic to, because although I am the age of their parents, generationally, I'm like them, the American-born generation. So many of them yearn to have a specific major, but their parents, who are very practical minded, as mine were, I understand this, say to them, what? You want to be an anthropology major? What's that? There are no jobs in that field. I don't even know what anthropology is. Drop out. We will disown you if you study anthropology. Art? Are you crazy? What a total waste of your life. And we're not going to pay for you to be educated in art. And what I want to do as a college president is try to bring about reconciliation within these families and explain, in America, it's okay to be an anthropology major. You will have a job. It will work out, and you can be a double major. That's what I want to promote. So I see this conflict play out again and again and again, where the American-born generation really wants to assimilate, and separately, I have my doubts about whether assimilation is successful, because no matter what passport you carry, no matter how well you speak English, there's always that, where are you really from? The sense that you're a perpetual foreigner. So those are my thoughts on Asian culture and how it's shaped who I am.
Thank you so much, President Wu. Dr. Moshi?
I have a few different ways that I think about this question. I mean, I think, for me personally, my relationship to culture has been very mixed and sort of reflective of the different sort of fragmentations in my own family history. So, for example, my parents were both Indian nationals, but they're from different regions in India, different religions. My mother's family was affected by the partition of India and Pakistan. My father's family was affected by famine. And so there was a lot of internal displacement and internal migration that their families experienced before they migrated to the United States. And so I think that, my parents themselves were sort of in fractured relationships to their own culture and language in their own ways, because they had these experiences of displacement before they arrived here. And then there were all these different, I guess, like renewed issues once they came to the United States. And so I think for me, there was never any sort of there was always a very, complicated understanding of culture, that there wasn't sort of this homogenous understanding of norms. My parents themselves challenged a lot of the expectations in their communities through their sort of interethnic, intercaste, interreligious marriage. And they were not the only ones in our family who did so. So I think that, there was always sort of an understanding that cultural norms, we understand them and we have options for how we engage them. And so I did grow up with a sense of that. I think in terms of my professional life, I was thinking about, sort of similar to some of what Frank was sharing, I think that I experienced a lot of pressure from my parents when I was younger. And I think about this with our students as well, to study something that would lead me to a job. And so, but I don't think of that so much as cultural. I think of that as structural. My parents were immigrants without any family here. My father's the only person who migrated from his family. My mother had one older brother. We have no social safety net in this country. Because of the ways that my parents grew up in India, we don't have necessarily like a home to go back to either. My parents actually met in New York City. So they don't have a sort of kind of like a return option where there was a place in India where they would go back to. And so, I think a lot of the pressures and anxieties that the pressures my parents put on me when I was younger really had to do with their recognition that if I didn't find a way to support myself, I'm the firstborn in the United States, the oldest sibling. If I didn't have a way to do that, they weren't necessarily going to be able to support me. And if we were in a crisis, they needed to actually lean on me to support them. And so I don't think of those as cultural. I think when I was younger, I thought of that more as culture. And I think as I got older, studied sociology and women of color feminisms, I learned more about some of those other roots to their fears and worries. And I did do actually what Frank is advocating for. I was a double major in college. I pursued gender and women's studies because that was my interest. But I pursued psychology because that sounded like something where you could get a job on the other side. And so I think that, in my own ways, I made those compromises to sort of, because, the truth is that I had those anxieties also. It wasn't that I didn't have concern about my future. I just think that I had a different relationship to those questions because I had been born and raised here. And that was, something, so I could see some possibilities that my parents couldn't. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'll pass it to Eric.
Thank you, Provost. Second question. What types of anti-Asian crimes are you seeing in your community, and why are these hate crimes on the rise? And why don't we go to Dr. Munshi first this time?
Sure. I think that I was thinking about this question in relationship to some of my own experiences working in South Asian American communities after 9/11, because I think that one of the important points, and I know you mentioned this, President Coco de Felipe, in your opening comments about the sort of, patterns that we can see in different times that connect different forms of anti-Asian violence. So you mentioned Japanese internment. During the post 9/11 period, that was definitely a linkage that was often made because Japanese communities came out in solidarity with South Asian communities to sort of express the ways that our communities being targeted in that time had a lot of sort of similarities to the ways that the Japanese were targeted during World War II by both, at the level of interpersonal violence and at the level of state policy. And we see that today as well. I think a lot of the emphasis on anti-Asian violence today has really focused on these kind of individualized acts of violence that we see between individual people who are strangers. But I think that if we take a step back, we can see how, the larger issues that are at the root of anti-Asian violence have to do with who is seen as able to belong in the United States, who is seen as entitled to sort of citizenship and legal citizenship, but also social citizenship, who is seen as a threat to the United States and to national security. In the post 9/11 era, or in Japanese internment, that looked very specific based on the conditions. And I think it was more obvious in some ways in those times, like who was seen as a national enemy. I think in some ways today it's a little bit more subtle. We don't really necessarily see the connections between the ways that violence operates on the individual level and the ways that China is seen as a threat to the United States, communism, the economy. Like there are all these different ways that China is sort of figured in our kind of collective understanding. And so those that matters because that informs sort of these understandings of who belongs here ultimately. And so I think that some of the ways that I see anti-Asian violence operating in the communities that we work in is that there are these sort of like day-to-day, everyday concerns or insecurities about safety and the experiences of violence in sort of like movement through one's sort of pathways throughout their day, being on the street, being on the subway. But I think the larger issues also have to do with, who feels like they have rights, what are the kinds of resources that are being distributed to our communities, who sort of has like what communities are accessing general sort of safety and security more broadly, I think are also things that we have to consider when we think about anti-Asian violence.
Thank you. And Frank, may I call you Frank?
Absolutely.
Okay, same question to you.
So, when the pandemic started, um, all this violence started too. It was people being spit on, shoved to the ground, kicked in the head, shoved in front of subways to their death, stabbed, shot in Atlanta. The serial murders, 6 of the 8 victims being Asian women, and it starts with just someone shouting slurs. Go back to where you came from. This is your fault. You're making us sick. The common epithets, and sometimes people would say to me, early on, they would say, "Well, this is just random. This is just it's street crime." But and as a lawyer, I know that I cannot be sure beyond a reasonable doubt that it's a hate crime motivated by animus, right? In every instance, but you see the pattern. It's not one case. It's not a dozen cases. It's actually hundreds of cases, even in places such as New York City, where there have been Asian Americans going back 150 years. And when you see that pattern, you realize, okay, maybe one of these is random, but this pattern is racial. They do not go up to people who don't look Asian and say, you caused this virus. They look at the color of skin, the texture of hair, the shape of eye, and it's mistaken identity twice over. What I mean by that is the people who were attacked included people who were Burmese, Filipino, Korean. And don't get me wrong, it wouldn't be right to specifically confirm that it was a Chinese person in ethnicity before kicking them in the head. That would be wrong too. But this hatred is directed at just sort of a generic representative of the Orient. The other way it was mistaken identity is these were Americans. They're immigrants. They're green card holders. They're not foreigners. Some are 3rd, 4th, 5th generation neighbors and co-workers, literally or metaphorically, to the people who are attacking them. So when there's anger about China or Japan or something overseas, and it's important to say, Japan was an aggressor during World War II. Anger at Japan, absolutely. But Japanese Americans were the people whose ancestors left the Japanese empire. Anger at China, whether it's about trade or human rights, appropriate. My parents and grandparents were on the other side of a civil war in China, which is how they ended up in Taiwan and then in the United States. So this is mistaken identity twice over. It's the you all look alike phenomenon. Plus, it's Americans who happen to be of Asian ancestry being blamed for something apparently from Asia. And it's not just that. There were people who are Latina who were attacked by people shouting vicious anti-Asian slurs because they had the misfortune of looking Asian, in the same way that South Asians after 9/11, Sikhs in particular, were attacked because they were perceived as Arab or Middle Eastern or Muslim, even though they may have been South Asian and Sikh. So that's how this hatred works. They're just looking for the person attacking isn't looking to actually address the issue of COVID. They're looking for a scapegoat, somebody to blame who isn't at fault.
Thank you, Frank. Provost, next question is yours.
Okay, thank you. And I'll start with Frank this time. So how can we promote greater representation and inclusivity for AAPI individuals in various industries, particularly in leadership positions?
Right. Let me address a comment in the chat about anti-Asian violence perpetrated by Blacks. There's a great study. It's a rigorous objective study that found that the majority of attacks during the pandemic that appeared to be hate crimes against people of Asian background were not committed by Black people. Not. However, the media depictions were overwhelmingly of Black on Asian violence. So there's a mismatch. Now, I'm not saying there were not Blacks who attacked Asians. There were. There were Latinos who attacked Asians. There were whites who attacked Asians. And in a couple of instances of terrible gun violence, there were people of Asian descent attacking Asians. And some people seem to applaud that. Some commentators, right-wing commentators, seem to be happy that it was Asians attacking Asians. But the media depictions overwhelmingly emphasize in a way that does not match the reality Black on Asian crime. So that's related to my answer to your question. Coalition building. This isn't, sometimes people introduce me and say, he's an advocate for Asian American civil rights. I cringe at that. I'm not an advocate for Asian American civil rights. I'm an advocate for civil rights and for including Asian Americans in civil rights the same way that everyone has a stake in the shared promise and the social contract. So this isn't special pleading. These are universal principles that we profess, that we claim, and it's what has made this nation so great. So how can we have better representation? By building bridges, not by attacking others. And from time to time, I've been in a room where it's just Asian Americans, and there are Asian supremacists. There are Asian people who will say, we're smarter, we're harder working, we're going to take over. And I think, geez, please do not say that out loud. You're just going to inspire more hate crimes, and people are going to think you're speaking for me. So it's so important to build bridges. And to Sonia Munchi's point, Asian American brings together people whose ancestors fought total wars, right? In Asia, there are very few Asians, right? Because that is associated with imperialism. But here, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and Korean Americans who just 3 generations ago, or just 2 generations ago, or in some instances, even now, their cousins are fighting and killing one another along ethnic lines, come together as Asian Americans. Same thing with South Asian identity, right? Here, there is more possibility to cross caste lines, religious lines, other lines that are invisible to people who don't quite understand, because they think, oh, well, you're Asian, they're Asian. They don't realize, no, in Asia, these 2 groups really don't get along. But here in America, you have to. So coalitions.
Thank you. Dr. Mushi?
Yeah, I was gonna add, I just dropped a link in the chat in case it's helpful to a report that was conducted by Dr. Janelle Wong that has a little bit of the evidence to what Frank was just stating about the ways that media representation of violence against Asian Americans in this period has really focused on escalating tensions between Black and Asian communities that are not based in actual evidence of the numbers of who has been sort of involved in different forms of violence. I think also to the point in the chat about the history of Asian Americans and Black communities in the United States, that period that's being referenced of when Chinese workers came here in the 1800s to help build the railroads. A lot of the organizing that happened to lead to the passage of the Page Law, which was passed in 1875, that restricted primarily Chinese women from migrating, and then the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. A lot of the organizing to make those, pieces of legislation possible came from workers that were primarily white workers organizing around labor rights to exclude immigrant workers. And so I think that's also a sort of mythology that has been misunderstood. There's a mythology there that sort of puts the roots of some of these racial tensions in that history, but is not actually accurate to the ways that racial politics and racial dynamics were operating at that time. I think I would just, add that to what Frank was saying, that Asian Americans are not a monolith. We know this. And I think that when we think about representation and inclusion, I think being really attentive to the differences within Asian American communities is important because it helps us to understand what are the needs. And so Asian Americans have been Asians have been coming to the Americas for hundreds and hundreds of years. Most recently, most Asians in the United States today are immigrants. I think in New York City, over 70% of people who are Asian identified are foreign born. There are different migration pathways that people have had. It's some people have come in the 1960s through educational visas or through middle-class professional jobs. There are people who've come through family reunification policies, people who have come as refugees. I mean, there's just different ways that people have entered this, people who have crossed the border without authorization. And so the types of issues that affect Asian American communities and Pacific Islander communities really vary. And I think that just like one thing that we can do collectively is just learn more about these nuances, because the challenges and barriers that communities face are really informed by the history of how that community came to be in the United States.
Thank you. Next question. How have you and members of your community responded to these hate crimes? And since it's basketball season, I'll say this is a jump ball question. Whoever wants to answer it first can.
Do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
So, you know, I am given hope. At the height of the pandemic, just as the vaccines were coming out, so when it was still sort of dangerous to be gathering, I went to a rally in downtown Flushing. And it gave me hope for two reasons. The first is I saw people who were young, people who were old, people who presumably had come to this country and those who were born here, people who were middle class, people who were not middle class, who were Asian, holding signs, ready to march. And I had never seen that before. Even during the Vincent Chin case, I hadn't seen so many people of Asian background who were going to assert themselves and do something I bet most of them had never done before, which is march, give speeches, protest, and assert themselves in a democracy. Actually, if you go back and look, Corky Lee, who passed away, who was a famed photographer who took so many photos of Asian Americans. There are some from the 1970s when there was police violence directed at Asian Americans. Some people don't know about that past. And there were some rallies back then that had thousands. But at least in my lifetime, I just hadn't seen this. So that's the first reason I was given hope. I saw, wow, Asian Americans marching. But the second reason is the speakers at this rally included then Lieutenant Governor, now Governor Kathy Hochul, Senator Chuck Schumer, civil rights activist Al Sharpton. There were speakers who were Black, there were speakers who were Latino, there were speakers who were Jewish, there were speakers who were with LGBT groups, labor unions, and of course there were Asian American speakers. But I cannot remember a time. So there were maybe 36 speakers, and I was, number 20 or so. And of the 19 speakers before me, easily half of them were not of Asian descent. And that's important. Why? Because this issue was significant enough that high-ranking government officials at state and federal level and civil rights activists knew they had to be there too. And in particular, Reverend Sharpton's speech, I don't think it was recorded, but he gave a speech that I thought was just terrific, where he addressed head-on Black on Asian crime. And he said that it was wrong and that he called upon fellow clergy in their pulpits to stand up and preach against it. And it was a compelling and sincere speech. So that gives me some hope.
I think, one of the things that I was thinking about with this question is, again, like there are these really long histories in New York City of Black and Asian communities working together, particularly around police violence. So in the 1990s, there was a coalition called the Coalition Against Police Brutality, CAPB, that was formed by different Black-led, Latinx-led, and Asian-led organizations. And also many of them were working in LGBTQ communities in New York City as well. And what kind of brought these different groups together was a shared understanding of the ways that policing impacted their communities and their neighborhoods. And so across different racial and ethnic lines, but with a sort of shared, often like a shared understanding of class and economic insecurity and the ways that communities that were primarily working class, poor, undocumented, were vulnerable to police violence. There was something that there was like overlapping and shared among their needs and interests. And so this coalition worked very closely for over a decade, and then eventually sort of morphed into what we now know as Communities United for Police Reform, sort of like the iteration. But the reason I bring that up is because I think that in the communities that I've worked in, and particularly in the post 9/11 period, there was a lot of concern about the advancement of some of the responses to hate crimes and hate crimes legislation, and the ways that the responses to hate crimes looked to criminalize, to increase the power of the criminal legal system as a way to create more safety for some communities. And so in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, many of the communities that I was working in at that time felt this tension of communities are feeling under attack by other people in other communities of color or other individual people. Is the answer to this that we want to bring in more policing and punishment, or are there other solutions to protect ourselves and one another? And so I think from that period, there were a lot of strategies that emerged in different communities that didn't necessarily want to see more policing as a response to hate crimes, but other kinds of forms of creating safety, alternative forms of documentation, public education, different kinds of infrastructures in neighborhoods to support the safety of individuals. So for example, like in this period, we've seen things like community supporting, like community escorts, different kinds of, like to escort people publicly if someone feels afraid to walk alone, different types of ways to bring resources into like for elders or people who are disabled or people who have other kinds of vulnerabilities to being in public spaces. And this is sort of kind of like a combination of like in response to hate crimes, but also in response to some of the challenges through the pandemic and the different kinds of vulnerabilities and insecurities that we've seen in our communities. And so I think that these kinds of like forms of infrastructure building to support one another has been a way to then also kind of think about safety and well-being more generally, including hate violence, but also beyond.
Thank you. I just want to give an update that I just got that Senator Liu is running late, but he's hoping to join us at 2:00. Provost, I think you have the next question.
Thank you, Eric. So the next question, what are the challenges of building alliances between AAPI and Latino or African American communities? So I'll start with Frank.
Yeah, so I would say there are three. One is just animosity, right? I mean, there's no love lost, and that's even true among Asian Americans toward other Asian Americans. From time to time, I've given speeches to groups of Chinese immigrant entrepreneurs, and do you know who they're most aggrieved about? It's not blacks, it's not whites. They're most angry about South Asians who are doing better than them, right? So there's just like, and Mandarin speaking Chinese versus Cantonese speaking Chinese, the China-Taiwan issues, right? I mean, so every community divides and divides and divides, right? So that's the first. The second is the model minority myth. Asian Americans are held up as a wedge, and there are many demagogues, including Asian Americans, who say, look at the Asians, they made it, why can't you? An inappropriate comparison. And there's a sense that Asians are crazy rich Asians, right? They're all well-to-do. The actual truth is Asian Americans, more than any other demographic, this is just a statistical truth, including other communities of color, have income stratification, the highest level. You might ask, well, how can that be? Because there are two flows. One are the folks who are transferring wealth or sending their well-to-do children here. And yes, they can pay $25 million for a penthouse condo in Manhattan. No question. There is a group like that, and they're buying it with cash. But there are also those who are undocumented, who are the rideshare drivers. They're the servers at the all-you-can-eat seafood buffet. So there are these two migration streams, and there's this huge gap. So the model minority myth obscures all that. It says, oh, Asians, they've made it. They've got no problem. So there's a sense of racialized resentment, and there always has been, at this notion that Asian Americans are Johnny-come-latelys who are doing too well. But the third and final aspect is the perpetual foreigner syndrome. You know, it used to be fresh off the boat was a pejorative phrase, but then it became a hit TV show, so that phrase has been reappropriated. And about 2/3, it varies by ethnicity, of Asian Americans are foreign born. And I respect that. There's nothing wrong with being fresh off the boat or airplane or whatever it is. However, there are also Asian Americans whose families 6 generations ago founded Chinatown. And because of restrictive immigration laws, some families have these gaps. Generations 6, 5 generations ago were here. Then the third and fourth were not, because they were deported or couldn't get in. They were excluded. But these are families that can trace their history back to the 1850s, yet everyone is treated as if we just got here. And so there's a sense of civil rights being domestic, right? Civil rights isn't for you. You could go back someplace else, except you can't. I'm a kid from Detroit. That's where I grew up. I was born in the United States. So going back for me would be going back to Detroit. But there's this lack of acceptance that you can really, truly, at the end of the day, be an American, much less a minority and disadvantaged.
Thank you, friend. Dr. Mushi?
I would just add that, I think that there's just so much misinformation about both about Asian Americans that feeds into some of the challenges and tensions, but also misinformation about Black communities and Latinx communities, and also about our historic and present relationships. And I was just thinking about how, actually teaching at BMCC has been a space for me to really engage some of these challenges and tensions, because, as BMCC is 85% students of color, 70% Black and Latinx, and about 15% students of Asian descent. So my Asian American history classes are usually, predominantly not filled by students of Asian descent. And so that has been like one space that I've really been able to sort of see the ways that misinformation circulates, the ways that some of the things that Frank is talking about, like ideas about Asians as being forever foreigners, that we don't understand American history as including Asians, even though Asians have been here for hundreds of years. And really to be able to work with students of different racial and ethnic backgrounds to see how, for hundreds of years, our relationships we've been in relationship with one another, and that there are a lot of moments that we can look to and people we can look to, and social movements and cross-racial solidarities that can help us kind of understand a different story about the ways our communities can be in connection with one another, as opposed to a lot of it's kind of like dominant narratives that really push us apart, and often I think are pushing us apart through the different things that Frank already mentioned around thinking about scarcity of resources, putting us in competition with one another, scapegoating and targeting other groups for the lack of resources or investment in our communities. And so I think having spaces, as we're all educators, having spaces for more of that kind of education and information sharing, I think really does help to build greater understanding across different groups.
Thank you. I just want to remind the audience that they can drop any questions that they might have into the chat or into the Q&A section, because we do want to hear questions from the audience as well. The next question we have is, what are some of the most pressing policy issues facing the AAPI community today, and how can we advocate for change, both the local and national levels?
Just getting included. So much data, even now, looks at disparities in a white and Black manner, and even Latinos are not included. So just getting included in the data, because if there's not data, when you say things, people don't believe you. They say, well, nah, I doubt that, right? So you have to be able to show people some data. And if you're going to address anything as a matter of public policy, that's where it begins. There's also a complicated issue in there of what's called data disaggregation. I'll leave it to Sonia, who is more expert than I am on this. And one of the difficulties there is some of the most vicious opponents of data disaggregation are right-wing Asian Americans. So there's a lot of complexity with all of this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, data disaggregation is something that Asian American communities have been, many Asian American communities have been fighting for a long time, with also resistance within and outside of Asian American communities, primarily those who would stand to lose something by these sorts of efforts to pull apart the data to better understand what's happening within the Asian American Pacific Islander communities, which is, as we've already said, like there's just such a range. So Asian Americans are the most internally heterogeneous racial and ethnic group in the United States. And so the disparities of income, wealth, other economic factors are greater within Asian Americans than any other racial and ethnic group. We have the highs and the lows. And when all the data is put together, it's really hard to see that. So for example, Frank had already mentioned sort of mythologies about the model minority, or these kinds of representations of Asian Americans as being economically successful and having wealth and being very educated and like formally educated, when the realities of Asian American communities are much more complex. So when we think about policy issues, we really want to center the most vulnerable and the most impacted by policy Asian Americans, are the ones who are most impacted in their day-to-day lives, their kind of basic resources for safety, well-being, and health. I think, some things that I was thinking about with this question is, like, again, to the point of, like, these aren't necessarily Asian American issues. These are general policy issues that affect Asian Americans because of the specific variables in the Asian American community. So for example, Asian Americans, as Frank already said, have some of the highest poverty levels in New York City. The majority of Asian Americans in New York City are actually essential workers. And depending on which group you're looking at, so for example, Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities, those numbers are up to almost 60%. And so when we think about, like, what policies we want to advocate for to support Asian Americans, it's like better working conditions for workers, conditions that improve their safety and health, conditions that support service workers to have more economic security. So these are like restaurant workers, cab drivers, nail salon workers, delivery workers. Depending on the Asian American community, some Asian American communities have a lot of issues with language access, limited English proficiency, and Chinese immigrant communities are one of the lowest levels of English proficiency in New York City. So thinking about, like, what are the ways that we can support people to our institutions to provide culturally competent, linguistically specific services. And then other policy issues are, beyond the local, thinking about immigration. So again, it's like, depending on which Asian American subgroups we're talking about, there might be some really specific policy issues. So for example, for Southeast Asian communities that have been targeted for detention and deportation ever since changes in immigration law in 1996, that's a really important concern. That many of their community members are continued to be detained and then deported back to Southeast Asia because of the ways that the criminal legal system, immigration systems, and different migration flows have interacted. So if you asked, like, a Southeast Asian community organization, what are important policies that you're pushing for, they're really looking to change immigration policy to be able to secure people's status in the United States. Similarly, like, the Pakistani community right now is fighting for TPS, temporary protective status, after the severe flooding in Pakistan last year. There are over 60,000 undocumented Pakistanis in the United States. And for them, going back to Pakistan is not an option, given the literal, like, conditions of life there at this time, post that severe crisis. In the Nepali community, fighting for TPS was an issue relatively recently, and it was granted. So I think that, really that's another point to, like, the data disaggregation. Because so many of the Asians in the United States, in New York City, are migrants, they're foreign born, they're kind of in transition from Asia to here, like, things, the what's going on in other parts of the world impacts the local fights and the local advocacy for policy change that will improve their quality of life and their ability to, be, again, like, safely and securely in the United States. Just leave it there.
Provost, would you like to go ahead with the next question?
I actually have one question. So we all heard about this Asian as a model minority. So according to your experience from research, from your practical experiences, do you think this is a myth? Or if yes, how do we address this? I'll start with Dr. Mushi.
Do we think the model minority myth is a myth?
Asian is a model minority. Is that a myth? Do you think it's a myth?
I think that, the idea of the model minority is something that developed at a particular time and place. So if we look at the history of that term, it comes out of, sort of a representations of Asians, particularly like Chinese communities and actually also Japanese communities in the 1960s, at a time when there was also a lot of advocacy towards civil rights. Actually, maybe Frank can speak about this more because of his expertise. But as there were like more, let's say, victories in the civil rights movement, and civil rights were becoming more institutionalized, and then 1965 happens, and we have the passage of the Civil Rights Act. There are ways in which we see Asian American communities being represented in contrast to the fights and the demands of the civil rights movement. So there are, several articles we can look at, for example, in like the New York Times or other mainstream publications that profile different Asian American communities and compare them very directly to Black communities. So if we look at the history of the model minority idea, that term even, and that concept, it's from its root was used as a way to drive a wedge between Asian and Black communities. Because essentially the message was that why are there being demands made on the US government to provide support, resources, investment in Black communities when you look at the Asians and they're doing it themselves? So one example is like a New York Times article that profiled Japanese American communities. And the point of that article is about how the Japanese were able to rebuild themselves after internment without asking for help from the United States government. So it's sort of privileging these ideas of like Asian Americans are self-sufficient and they don't ask for resources and they're quiet and they work hard and they don't fight for their rights because they're like culturally, sort of able to historically accurate. The Japanese community did fight for reparations and for reinvestment in their communities. So that kind of representation is not accurate. But what it did, it was created a story about who Asian Americans are. And then later we see a similar kind of like round of these kinds of mainstream media articles about Chinese Americans, and we see it again in the 80s. And so there's this sort of resurgence of the idea of the model minority at different points in time where it's convenient, it's effective to pull Asian Americans apart. And then often part of the intention there is to compare Asian Americans to other communities of color. I think that there's, so to say that like, it's a myth, it's like, it's something that was created. So it's not, what it has, and it's been utilized, deployed in these very strategic ways. So in that sense, it's not based in reality. However, there are things that have happened because of Asian migration that align with these ideas of the model minority. It came before 1965 migration, but it's convenient that at the time that the idea of the model minority is being utilized, it's like, when it first appeared, it didn't have to do with this sort of upper middle class, professional Asian American migrant, because if we look historically at when it was used, those aren't the communities that are being talked about. It's like the Japanese who were interned, and it's about Chinese communities in California that predate the 1965 immigration laws changing. But when it changed, it sort of coincided with the migration of more professional Asian immigrants. And so there's sort of like this kind of idea that like, these are who Asians are. It worked together with those other kinds of constructs of the model minority, if that makes sense. So to say that, but again, to your question about whether it's a myth, I think that as we said earlier, there's a lot of evidence to show us that some of the things that are associated with being a model minority that have to do with class and economics and education is like much more complicated in reality for Asian Americans. There are those who are wealthy and who have college degrees and higher education, privileges, and all of the things that we associate with being a model. But then we also see that in the same category of Asian American, we have some, Asian American communities that are struggling to graduate from high school, that are housing insecure, that are limited English proficiency, that don't have health insurance. So, in that sense, the evidence doesn't really support that idea of what a model minority sort of successful Asian is. So on both ends, it's a myth.
Thank you, Dr. Mushi. But before we continue, Eric, should we introduce Senator John Liu to the audience?
Yes, thank you, Provost. So we've been joined by New York State Senator John Liu. Thank you very much, Senator, for joining us. We've kind of been going over a series of questions, but why don't we give you a chance to say a few words to the audience?
Thanks, Eric. I am sorry for my delay in getting onto this Zoom. I had a number of delays earlier, but great to be on once again. Thanks, Daisy, for inviting me. But I was not aware that I would be totally redundant and useless this year, given that you have Dr. Munshi as well as President Wu on. Like, you just don't need me anymore, Eric. Don't need me anymore.
I refuse to accept that, Senator.
I don't know, President.
And I don't give up
you
the
got
opportunity to say thank you for your support of CUNY.
Well,
Wonderful. You're
I'm
wonderful.
happy to say you're welcome. I'm never happy, so I'm not as happy as I would have liked to have been with the state budget, but there is definitely more for CUNY, as there should always be.
Thank you.
And between
Always.
you and Dr. Wu, you get the point. And I'm sorry I missed a lot of the substantive discussion, because the last couple of years that we've been doing this at Hostos, the discussions and questions have always been pretty intense in a good way. And I'm sure today's discussion was no less. So I don't know what you want me to talk about, Eric. I'm happy to talk about anything, but I feel like I'm just not even a third wheel, more like a sixth wheel here.
Well, certainly we appreciate having you. You are our returning champion. You've been with us for 3 of these events now. So we won't go through all of
I've been replaced in the spirit of continuous improvement. Out with the old, in with the new. And Asian Americans continue to make lots of progress.
Well, we won't go through all of the questions that the other panelists have already answered, but maybe just a couple, and specifically, what types of anti-Asian hate crimes have you seen in your community, and what has the response been?
Well, I'm sure it's been addressed already, and we have also talked about this very important topic in the last couple of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month celebrations with Hostos. Unfortunately, it still continues to be a problem. We have the whole gamut, from seemingly benign but nonetheless irritating incidents where people, go out of their way to cross the street as opposed to passing you on the sidewalk, to rude gestures about people having things stuck in their eyes, right? Frank knows all about that. To being told to go back to China and bring the virus with you, to unfortunately violent incidents and attacks. We had a Filipino American woman attacked over here in Elmhurst. She and her son were sent to the hospital. Her son is actually an Army veteran for the United States. So it's these attacks continue to happen, and there's still there's also some levels of discrimination that may not be violent or outright blatant, but you still have comments about that I can't even say newfound anymore. There's now this heightened animosity with China and with global politics, and Asian Americans, specifically Chinese Americans, they're the target of these investigations. So many people being accused of spying for China, starting with a very well-documented case of Dr. Wenho Lee, who's an American scientist working out of Los Alamos laboratories and being accused of spying for China, and basically his career and life being ruined. And after a few years, the government, the American government, basically said, "Oops," and didn't have anything anymore. And that unfortunately is a pattern that continues to this day, even right here with fellow New Yorkers. So it's something that we have to be very mindful of, this kind of animosity towards Asian Americans that oftentimes translates, sometimes blatantly, sometimes more latently, this discrimination against Asian Americans. And also, by the way, most people, I believe in a pan-Asian identity, because how many Filipino Americans or Vietnamese Americans or Korean Americans or Japanese Americans have been told in the last couple of years to go back to China? Nobody's making a distinction. Nobody, if they want to discriminate against somebody or attack somebody, they're not stopping and saying, wait a second, is this person Chinese? Or might she be Korean? Or might he be Vietnamese? It's just close enough. We're Asian, close enough. So the attacks come, the discrimination comes, the rude gestures come, and that's what we're faced with.
Senator, let me ask you another question, because you mentioned the time frame that really this is all tied to COVID, and when that started about 3 years ago, and that's when we saw the increase in a lot of this anti-Asian sentiment. I would have hoped that after 3 years, the situation might be improving, but it sort of sounds like it's been about the same for the past 3 years, and that we're just kind of having to live with it like we are with COVID. Do you think that's accurate?
I think to some extent it's not as bad as maybe in the first couple of years, but it's still worse than pre-COVID. So, it's still something that's very alarming. And I wouldn't say that it was COVID that brought about this wave of anti-Asian hate. In some ways, COVID accentuated it, and a lot of it, I believe, was released because of the former president's own continued rhetoric, continuing to, against the advice of his own advisors, to call this the Chinese virus. Trump even created a new anti-Asian slur called Kung Flu. And the guy basically invented that, or if he didn't invent it, he made it widely used. So a lot of this is coincident with COVID. It was not COVID that created it. It definitely accentuated it, and in some ways released this anti-Asian hate. To answer your question directly, once again, I think this third year has been perhaps not as horrific as 2021 or 2020 going into 21 or 2021 going to 22, but this past year still has been worse than pre-COVID. So, I mean, that's my experience. And look, I had a lot of this bullshit when I was a kid in my young years, and I thought a lot of that was past me. But, it just came back these last few years. So it just brings back a lot of bad memories. It's nothing new. I'm sure President Wu can talk about some of his, or maybe he did already. But, we've all been through this. And this is the month. This is the month that we have to celebrate the accomplishments of Asian Pacific Americans, as well as reflect on our own struggles.
Let me open that question up to Frank and Dr. Munshi as well, if they have any comments on the timeline of the last 3 years.
Sure. All this comes together. Senator Liu, great to see you as always. And I agree with what you've said. I'll elaborate on how the model minority myth fits into all this. There are some Asian Americans who embrace the myth too. They say, yeah, we're super successful. And I want to acknowledge that. Anyone who lifts themselves up, more power to them. The aspect that makes it a myth is the racialized comparison and not taking into account that some, not all, but some Asian immigrants represent brain drain. Even if they're not coming with wealth, they're coming with human capital. They're scholarship students. They have an MD already. So they're starting with a huge advantage, and they're not like the cousins they've left behind, nor are they like domestic minorities. They represent a transnational elite. None of this is new either. Go back and look. I put it in the chat. You can Google it. Samuel Gompers. People might not know that name unless they're a historian. He actually was a progressive, a left-leaning labor leader. He wrote a pamphlet called Meat versus Rice. And it was a bestseller. You can pick up a copy on eBay if you want. And it's a metaphor, and it's also literal. He says Asians work too hard. They're unfair competition. So the claim about Asians is not they're inferior, it's they're superior. They're too hardworking. Let's keep them out. And he argued Asians subsist on rice. White people need to eat meat. Now, none of that's true, biologically. He said, this is unfair. And so there's this constant theme of the model minority myth where virtues are turned into vices. What is it to be hardworking? It's to be unfair competition. So it ratchets up racial resentment, not just as between Asian Americans and other people of color, but whites as well. This idea that there's a racial secret to Asian success, and it fits into the yellow peril. The Asians are all taking over. Go back and look at the Back to the Future movies starring Michael J. Fox and the terrible dystopian future that he imagines is one where he has a Japanese boss, right? It's this idea that Asians will become superior, whites will be subordinate, and it ties into not just the rise of Asia and China specifically overseas, but demographic change within the US. And the constant refrain is, which side are you on? Are you a sleeper agent for Beijing? Are you a spy? When you think about this, none of this is unusual. I grew up with my parents comparing me all the time to the children of their friends who were also of Asian background. And when they said, why can't you be like so-and-so who got a perfect SAT score? Did that make me want to work harder to be like so-and-so? No, it made me want to punch so-and-so in the nose, right? Which is a normal human reaction. And so when Asian Americans are held up and people say, why can't you be like Asian Americans? It just generates more resentment toward Asian Americans on the part of everyone, because it feeds this myth, this idea that the Asians are determined to rule the world, just like in comic books and science fiction, where the whole universe would be taken over by a Fu Manchu type character.
Dr. Munshi?
I don't really have anything to add except just one comment, which is that I think what Frank started with is an important point that, for a lot of Asian Americans, identifying with the model minority is important to them. And I think, I have my own experience of that transition of thinking about, I remember questioning, like, why is it wrong to be associated, or why is it bad, or what are the consequences of being associated with these seemingly positive traits, even if I didn't feel, for example, that I fit them. For example, I'm not someone who is interested in STEM or wealthy or the different kinds of things that the model minority evokes. And it was only really through taking Asian American studies classes or working in communities or kind of learning more about its origin and the ways that it's utilized and what are the sort of downsides of this sort of positive stereotype, that I was able to develop more of an understanding. So I think, and I think, you know, again, going back to the classroom, I feel like that's like a big conversation we often have in my Asian American Studies classes around like our own identifications and how when we have internalized these ideas about ourselves, whether or not we actually think our personal experience matches, there is this idea that there's something positive being said. Why is that something that we want to challenge? And I think, you know, as Frank and John and others have said, there's a lot of reasons to do that. So.
Yeah, and may I just quickly add that one of the downsides, I mean, it kind of feels nice that people think you're great, but you know, I don't think, it's my personal belief that there is no such thing as a benign stereotype. Stereotype is when somebody looks at you and judges you by the way you look. And just nothing good ever really comes out of that. The other real practical impact is it's a denial of public resources, because these Asians, they're all doing well. They don't need help. We don't need to worry about homeless Asians, even though there are. We don't need to worry about Asian kids who actually need more help in school. You know, it's just the denial of services. That's one of the very harmful aspects. And I definitely agree that it's divisive for Asian Americans, splits Asians apart from the majority community, and especially harmful when it drives a wedge between us and other communities of color.
So we've got time for one more question that I see here in the chat, because I do want to get everyone out of here by about 2:30. So it's a long question, but hopefully the answers will be concise. Philip asks, there is a disparity in the AAPI leadership existing in many facets of U.S. society, such as in the corporate sector, education sector, healthcare sector, and government sector, to name a few. What can be done to transcend narrow concepts of leadership and stereotypical traits of leaders that limit the ability to improve AAPI participation?
The senator should go first, and I will say publicly, I look up to him. He is my senior, and he has done something before anyone else tried, which is run for mayor of New York City. That was a historic run. And be like Senator Liu. Stand up, speak out, be engaged, be yourself. He is not a quiet Asian American. So I want to praise him publicly. That's what I would say.
Thanks, Frank. I got my ass kicked in that election, by the way. But you know what? We shouldn't be quiet. We should speak out, right? And I don't know. I mean, Eric, I saw that question in the chat, in the Q&A and the chat. I'm still trying to figure out what it means because I'm not that smart. But I don't know if there's a disparity in AAPI leadership. I think leadership in the Asian American community is, you know, multifaceted and multi-talented, and you have different levels of leadership and different perspectives of leadership. So I think we always need more of it in all of these sectors. Obviously I'm not that smart. I'm still trying to, and I'm among professors here, so I'm totally intimidated. What can be done to transcend narrow concepts of leadership?
Well, I think the question is asking, are there stereotypes that keep Asian Americans out of leadership positions in these sectors?
Okay. Thank you for that translation. That makes it a lot clearer, and I appreciate Philip for the question. Yeah, there are stereotypes. This is where I'm happy to have this chance to briefly elaborate on what I said before, that I don't think there's any such thing as a benign stereotype, because when it comes to Asians, it's like, oh yeah, they're good. They work very hard. The flip side of the hardworking stereotype is that, yeah, we work hard, but we're not really leaders. We can't really be put in positions of leadership, right? Or there'll be the other typical one. They're really good at math and science. The implication, we're probably not that good in other subjects like social sciences and the humanities. So, every stereotype, and I guess I'm drawing on my physics background here, every stereotype has an equal and opposite reaction. That would be Isaac Newton's law of social stereotypes, I guess. I just totally made that up. And, so there are these kinds of stereotypes. We talk about the glass ceiling, or in the case of Asian Americans, the bamboo ceiling, where, once again, a lot of times Asians are seen as very capable engineers, but can they be CEOs or CFOs or COOs? It's a much harder lift for people to even picture that. So the question is actually very insightful, even though it took me a while to understand the thrust of it. Thank you.
Frank?
I'll stick with my answer. Be like Senator John Liu. It requires that we do things that our parents would have said, "Oh, don't do that. That's a bad idea." So it's a combination. There's stereotypes that hold us back, but sometimes we hold us back. Some of the things I've said here, my parents would say, "Don't say those things. That's controversial. Don't do that." And I don't have the heart to tell them I've made a career out of being controversial. Right? That's how I've gotten to where I am, because we were all trained, right? Some of us are from cultural backgrounds where you do not speak to your elders until you are spoken to. You don't make eye contact. We weren't trained to shake hands and work a room and do things like that. And you need to be able to do a little of that. You can also be a leader with characteristically Asian traits, if you want to call it that, maybe quieter, but it requires that we adapt and adjust to the environment we're in. Again, great program.
And Dr. Munshi?
I think I'll just repeat my point about just the heterogeneity of Asian American communities. That I think this question, there have been moments in time where I've looked around, and in the spaces I've been in, I've found there's quite a bit of representation. So for example, in the nonprofit sector, or in different educational spaces where I see quite high numbers of Asian or South Asian representation. And so I think that, for me, this question is really about understanding the challenges and the barriers in different industries for opportunity, and that it looks different in different spaces and for different Asians. So I think that, the concept of the bamboo ceiling is one that sometimes applies to South Asians and sometimes doesn't. South Asians are often our leaders in some different industries, including tech. And so I think that, to have a better understanding, but then face other kinds of discrimination. So for example, many of the leaders in tech industry are often here on worker visas and aren't actually here in a permanent way. So then there's a different kind of insecurity. So again, just really paying attention to the different nuances within, so that we can best support the full AAPI community is really important.
Thank you. We're running short on time, but I want to throw it back to our president, Dr. Daisy Coco de Felippis, to see if you have any thoughts or comments for us.
First of all, let me say, this is absolutely wonderful. I know I'm going to be egotistical in what I'm going to say. So let me just tell you this. There's so much of what you said about the Asian community reminds me of growing up Latina as a young immigrant in the United States. And, to my great surprise, when I came here, I was Latina, not Dominican, not whatever. I think the music was going to have to wait 2 seconds. And so I want to say that we have a lot more in common. And it brings me back as well to going back to your college as a young faculty and a young dean, and beginning this whole infusing the curriculum for Asian culture, which came out of all the issues that were in Howard Beach. And so I went to Hawaii and the East-West Center, and I spent a month there, came back with multiple ideas, went back again to Hawaii and another whatever. And we did actually include a course at that time in the general education that had to deal with Asian culture. and we opened an Asian reading room, and the Japan Society donated multiple volumes to the York College Library. And you can see where my love for haiku comes from that period there. Also, it was amazing to see during that seminar the diversities that I also realized that to be Japanese was not to be Chinese or Korean or Indian, and that each, the same way that is to be Dominican doesn't mean that you are Peruvian or Chilean. And so on. So we sort of, but at the same time, there's great comfort when they lump you into one group to feel that you're not alone. That you're not alone fighting it all, that there's so many commonalities. And the more I learn about the Asian culture, the more I realize that immigrants and human beings, that was the haiku I read. We're in this, I'm too Hispanic. So we sort of, this is like lives are the rivers that end up in the sea, which is death, right? So we're sort of passing through, and we go through difficult moments, but it's so much nicer when you can be kind to each other. Senator Liu, President Frank Wu, by the way, he reached out to me. Queens College came to visit this Queens College alumna when I first came in and had lunch with me, and I'm one of the biggest fans that Frank could ever have. And I am so happy to meet Sonia Munshi, who is a great friend of my son, as it turns out. In Spanish, we say that the world is a handkerchief. In English, you say 6 degrees of separations. We all sort of connected. I feel so connected with you all, with all that you said this afternoon. And Senator, you will never be irrelevant at Hostos or anywhere else. And I just think that you should just get up again and run again for bigger office. I'm happy to manage your campaign from the South Bronx. Okay. And Provost and Dr. Radesky, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you to all of our guests. That concludes our program. Thank you to Senator Liu, to President Frank Wu, to Dr. Sonia Munshi, and of course to the team here at Hostos that helped make this event possible. Our president, Diana Kramer, Victor Santana, our provost, Shiang-Kwei Wang. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.